If the Richat structure or Eye of the Sahara isn't Atlantis, then what is it? In my previous videos, I said that the Richat structure isn't Atlantis, and proposed my own location for it, which is submerged 15,000 feet underwater in the Caribbean Sea. And since the Caribbean Sea is part of the Atlantic Ocean, the location I've proposed for Atlantis is in the Atlantic Ocean, which is consistent with Plato's dialogues on the subject. The other advantages that my hypothesized location has over the Richat structure, other than the fact that it's actually underwater, is that the dimensions of the rings are a near exact match with those provided by Plato, while the widths of the Eye of the Sahara's rings are significantly larger. Nevertheless, I still believe that the Eye of the Sahara is an artificial structure, and that it was built by the people of Atlantis. But if I'm literally saying that the Richat structure was built by the people of Atlantis, how could it not be the lost city of Atlantis? I'll try to explain precisely what I mean by this. But first, a sort of digression to a war that happened more than 200 years ago. The War of 1812. In the War of 1812, the British occupied Washington, D.C., burning nearly all of its public buildings down. Eventually, the war settled into a stalemate and was ended in 1815 with the signing of a peace treaty, with no territorial changes. But imagine if the British won the war and the United States lost control of Washington, D.C., but kept most of their other territories. The destruction and permanent loss of the nation's capital would have been both a material and symbolic loss, and the leaders of the United States would naturally expect to try to rebuild their capital in a location that was safe from British attack. Which location would they have chosen, and what would have been the layout and design of the new capital? For the first question, the Americans would have chosen a location far away from the Atlantic coastline, where they would be safe from a future British attack, were it to come. Secondly, they would very likely have rebuilt their destroyed capital with precisely the same layout as their old capital, and with the same buildings that had been erected at the time of the old capital's burning. The reconstruction of the nation's capital as an exact replica would serve to both restore the nation's wounded pride, and be a potent symbol of defiance against the British. Now, let's imagine that this situation as it would have played out with the Atlanteans. As I suggested in a previous video, the people of Atlantis were likely aware of their impending doom. They may not have known precisely what day it would have come, but it is unlikely that the Atlanteans, as advanced as they were described as having been, would have been caught completely by surprise. One can imagine the last days as having been filled with fear and apprehension, of a sense that the end was near. Knowing that their city was to be sink beneath the waves, the Atlanteans would have naturally desired to reconstruct the glory of their former city from whence they could rebuild their civilization, and to build the new capital city to resemble the old as much as possible, to preserve a sense of continuity and familiarity with a city that they had dwelt in since time immemorial. Where would they choose to rebuild? Certainly, as far from the oceans as possible, to prevent the recurrence of the disaster in the distant future. This is consistent with the Eye of the Sahara being located hundreds of miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean, sufficiently far that they would never have to live in fear of a destruction by the forces of water ever again. As stated earlier, the Atlanteans would be expected to have rebuilt their city as a replica of their original capital city, save with one exception. The original city was built, according to Plato, at the very beginning of the civilization's history, by Poseidon himself, and must have been in existence for ages by the time that its destruction was imminent. It would be expected that the population of the city and the civilization as a whole would have increased appreciably, perhaps even dramatically, so that a new capital would require a much larger living space. This is again consistent with the Richat structure being significantly larger, by around 2 to 3 times in size than the description of the capital city as Plato described. However, its overall structure of concentric rings is essentially identical to Plato's description thereof. It is my belief that the Eye of the Sahara, or the New Atlantis, was in the process of being built, possibly nearly complete, with an organized evacuation and resettlement plan either underway or about to commence when the cataclysm that destroyed the old Atlantis struck, earlier than was anticipated, erasing the civilization from existence and killing all but a few isolated survivors. Noah and his family were among the survivors, thus negating the entire resettlement plan. Perhaps the survivors could not even locate this new Atlantis, and even if they were able to, a city intended to be inhabited by millions of people would have been unsuitable for a few survivors reduced to a primitive state, struggling to survive day to day. The New Atlantis or the Richat Structure remained lost for 11,600 years until it was identified in the late 20th century by satellite photography. The Richat Structure is too similar to Plato's Atlantis for it to not have some relation to it. Yet it is also different enough that it's hard to say it was the city of Atlantis as described by Plato. This narrative attempts to reconcile this apparent contradiction. The Eye of the Sahara was the New Atlantis, an attempt by the Atlanteans to reconstruct the city that they foresaw would sink beneath the waves. But they were too late, the cataclysm struck before they could evacuate and resettle the new city that they built.